In this episode, my guest was Kosta Kolev. He's a serial entrepreneur, founder of several startups. He is an advisor to several startups as well, and a product leader. So we talk about many different topics. We talked about a lot about leadership, frameworks, mental models, mental health as well. We dive really deep into some of those subjects. So if that's something you're interested in, I'm sure you're going to enjoy the episode. And if you do, please leave a review, subscribe on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or YouTube. That really helps to get the podcast in front of more people. And that also helps me then to bring on more interesting guests. Thanks. All right. Kosta, welcome to the Founders Lounge.
Thanks for having me, Matisse. There we go. You psyched me out.
That is so funny. So we were just talking about the name, and it's a tricky one, I know, but that's where we're getting. That's what it is. So we were talking. I was talking to Tim, our mutual friend, and it's funny because he brought up your name a few times. I've known Tim for maybe 4 years or so now, and your name came up every now and then. And it's funny because I don't actually remember what he said about you, but you know how they say you don't remember what people say, but you remember how they make you feel.
Yeah.
Whenever your name came up, I just remember this guy sounds like an interesting guy. And like at some point I need to talk to him, or I need to meet him at some point. And now here we are. So I'm looking forward to meet you, and I'm looking forward to learn more about you and to just, chat with you. And maybe for a start, can you tell a little bit about who you are? And maybe that's a funny question, but why do you think I got those feelings that you're an interesting guy?
Well, I guess the question here is, do I give the context of my relationship with Tim, or do I just go? Because I think that's a bit of an interesting thing, right? I guess we're always judged. Yeah. We're always judged and influenced by intermediaries, especially in this like little ecosystem that is kind of like entrepreneurship. But if I was to hazard a guess, Tim and I have had some really interesting conversations over the years around product management, kind of like, how do you come up with frameworks to make big life decisions? And also just, I guess, the ups and downs and craziness of startup life. So if I was a betting man, those would be the three things that I think you guys might have covered.
This episode is sponsored by freelancer.com, the largest online marketplace for freelancing and crowdsourcing. If you want to delegate some of your work or need to hire an expert to work on virtually anything with any skill, then this is the place for you. They've got over 60 million registered freelancers, so you can find pretty much anyone to do anything you want. Even NASA has been using it for years, and I've been using it recently to get some cool new stuff done for the podcast. So if you want to give it a try, go to freelancer.tflpod.co and you'll get a £30 voucher to start with your first project. So that's freelancer.tflpod.co. I'll put the link in the description. We probably talked about product management. That's usually what we talk about, either product management or entrepreneurship or frameworks, I suppose. And I think we're going to dive into that as well, because I'm also big on frameworks, and you are as well. So I'm sure we're going to talk about that.
The gift and curse of product people, eh?
I guess so. Yeah, I think so. Cool. And then, can you tell a little bit more about you? So I've seen a little bit about what you do, but maybe just a bit of background for everyone to give a quick intro.
So I'm Kosta. I was originally born in Bulgaria. I moved to the UK when I was about 10 years old. So I've kind of grown up half Bulgarian, half British, I guess, to some extent, culturally, which has been quite interesting. I've always loved building stuff and tinkering stuff. I started working when I was really young. So I was kind of like working full time by the time I was like 15. And then by the time I kind of got to university, I really didn't enjoy university. I didn't find it that exciting or stimulating, but I stumbled into entrepreneurship and stumbled into startups. And that was where I really got excited about the scale and potential of technology. And also just kind of like realized how small the world is, in the sense that, I think and I think a lot of founders actually can relate to this, But if you kind of like get started with the internet, you quickly realize, at least in the past, that you can put something online and before you know it, you can make $1 or, you can get thousands of visitors maybe on your website from loads of different countries. And it's that scale of kind of like impact and the ability to kind of like put stuff online and really kind of see it take off and see strangers that you've never really met interact with it. That's kind of what pulled me into Startup Land and kind of got me to drop out of university. And then 10 years later, now just over a decade, early stage ventures and startups have been my life. Most recently, I'm working on a company called Calliper, which is all around data and collaboration, helping bring sort of people and data together and sort of largely help teams align processes and strategies around metrics. I guess that's the really kind of like high level story. Happy to deep dive where you think would be most interesting.
Can you first talk a little bit about, so you mentioned that you got excited when you built something when you were young and you started getting some either made your first dollars online or got those first visitors, which is interesting because a lot of people that I know, they're technical people and they love the building stuff, but they really, really struggle to actually get those first few people on the website. So I'm wondering, what was your initial experience, or what were those first entrepreneurial steps for you?
Yeah, so I think the very first thing that I did was actually go to a hackathon. A bunch of my friends kind of like dragged me to this event, and I guess I was a mechanical engineer by background, so I guess technical, but not software technical. And all of a sudden I went to this event and I found it absolutely mind-blowing how, there was these group of people, there was probably around like 30 or 40 of us in Manchester in this particular hackathon over a weekend, and we were all there just to like work and learn and like build cool shit. And it was such a collaborative, fun environment. And I think that's the point when I first got in touch with like, I guess, real software and real technology. And I think that's really kind of what sparked my initial interest, because I don't know, it was such a juxtaposition between the rest of the university experience going to this event, because typically what I think most of the people around me would do would be like, maybe if they're doing sports, they do some sports on the weekend, but largely Friday, Saturday is about drinking and partying, and then Sundays maybe catching up with some, coursework, and then, Monday you're kind of back into the flow of being a student again. But here, we arrived in Manchester on Friday night, and it was literally working, probably worked around like, I don't want to say 40 hours, but like, that we were definitely like driving way into the early hours of the morning on both Friday and Saturday to kind of like, develop an idea. And I think that was the first thing that got me started, that really, I guess, introduced me to the network, into the ecosystem of entrepreneurship. And from there, it was just like so intoxicating that I kept pulling the thread until I kind of realized, okay, I can code a little bit of a website, I can build a little bit of a brand. I started going from like, waiting tables and cleaning toilets to then like building websites and brands for people. And then that's kind of how then accelerated me into the world of startups more broadly.
Interesting. A similar experience for me was, I suppose, similar. When I was studying computer science, that was in Slovenia. And I joined the student organization. It was an international student organization. We would organize events, we would organize parties, and we would travel a lot because it was international, right? So other chapters across Europe, they organize events, and we'd go there and we'd have everything for free. You just had to cover your travel expenses. And I got so engaged in that. It was incredible. It was also so completely different from the traditional just studying, right? We had loads of fun. We worked on a lot of practical stuff. Sometimes we also worked all night, right? There was an event tomorrow. Half of the things were not ready yet. We just had to work all night to make it happen, right? And you get those real life experiences and friendships and, I don't know, a certain level of just maybe even perseverance that you develop through that, if you really, if you really enjoy it and if you really want to achieve something through it. And it was, I would say, definitely one of those life-changing things that also absolutely got me into entrepreneurship, because I think I saw some similarities between what we were doing, because we were just, in a way, building stuff, right? And there was no, we were our own bosses in a way, right? It was just us and our organization. There was nobody telling us what to do, and we're just creating stuff out of nowhere, which is, for me, part of the beauty of business, right? You just create something.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's that, I guess, camaraderie and that finding a tribe of like-minded people, which I think it's really interesting, right? If you find a tribe that you really kind of connect with, you naturally kind of tend to follow and engage. And I think that this is why entrepreneurship, like, many people just kind of like stay in the ecosystem and do startup after startup. I think part of it is the community and the friendships and the tribes that you end up building, of like-minded people that want to grow, want to build, want to, leave a dent in the universe, for a lack of better expression.
How else do you look at building high-performing teams and managing high-performing teams? How do you approach that, I suppose?
So I think that maybe let's again, frameworks, right? Let's start top down. I think high performance, how are you actually measuring that? Is it the velocity that you're moving at? Is it the sort of consistency of velocity over time? How do you actually think about it? Because I feel first and foremost, you need to have a very clear goal, and you need to have a clear way to be able to measure and monitor that goal. Because I feel ultimately everyone needs to understand where the team is headed towards, because otherwise you really can't empower the team to make autonomous decisions, because people will just make decisions without really knowing what trade-offs they should and shouldn't make, because they're struggling to understand how things connect up on a higher picture. So I think that first and foremost, having a really clear, well-articulated vision of, what we're aiming towards and why that's important, on a both commercial and personal level is kind of really I think something that a lot of people overlook. And I think as humans, we're such mission-oriented people that, that's a really important first step.
When you say personal level, what exactly do you mean by that?
So I think one thing that I am trying to bring into my one-to-ones with my team a lot more is just how are you personally looking to grow and develop, over the next quarter, over the next half within this project. And I feel that's really important because one, it helps that person sort of communicate what's important to them and how they're looking to grow and develop. And that I think makes it much easier then to kind of manage them and potentially help prioritize work in different ways to be able to actually give work to them that they're going to find more meaningful, more fulfilling, which is naturally going to get them more excited. They're going to contribute more. They're going to communicate more. I think that has a lot of positive benefits. But secondly, it also, as a leader, as a manager, helps you understand what are the current gaps in the team. Because naturally there's going to be, every team has strengths and weaknesses. So if people are talking about where they want to grow and where they want to develop, if you have a clear gap in that team, how are you then going to create a system or a process or some kind of fallback system to make sure that this doesn't fall through the cracks? So, for example, if everyone on the team is a ferocious kind of delivery machine, but quality is not the number one priority, everyone focuses on speed much more than quality, as a team, how are you going to resolve that, right? Because everyone says that's not something that they're good at. So do you need to bring in something external? Does someone need to take the knee and say, okay, I'm going to be in charge of this as a team? How do you actually have that conversation, and how do you get on the same page around what trade-offs we are willing and we're not willing to make?
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. That makes sense.
But after that, I think once you kind of have a high level goal within the team, I think that probably the next most important thing is just to align on what trade-offs we're willing and not willing to make in search of that goal. And I guess the most common thing is speed, cost, and time, right? So, if push comes to shove, which one are we going to forfeit first, and then which one are we going to forfeit second? And if you only had to choose one, which one would it be? I think that's also really important because, again, it helps the team triangulate to some common understanding around how we're actually going to attack this challenge and how we're going to move forward together. And then beyond that, I think it's just principles and different, I guess, are we going to use Agile? Are we going to use Scrum? How are we going to even write tickets? I'm a little bit of a process. I really like processes and systems, as you can probably tell with my little weird document. So I think having templates around within like standard product management, like what's the definition of done on a given ticket? How are we going to do QA? Who actually is responsible for writing the tickets? Is it engineering? Is it product? Is it design? How do we then actually monitor stuff once we've pushed it to production? How long do we continue to monitor for it? How do we invalidate or validate a given hypothesis, right? So how much time do we have to wait once this feature is released in terms of engagement that we see on it to say, yes, this was net positive for our business and product, or no, this was net negative. So I think all these things around like just getting building more common ground as a team in terms of how you're going to work, how you're going to communicate, when you're going to communicate, what are the rituals, what are the habits, what are the routines is really important. And then off the back of that, I think it's then building personal relationships with everyone in the team, understanding everyone's individual strengths and weaknesses, and figuring out, how do you actually make time to also feel connected to the team outside of the sort of work that can sometimes get a little bit transactional if you just focus on deliverables. I think top down, that's kind of how I'd approach it, or those are some of the important principles that I think about. It's, having the right strategy, aligning on kind of like the commercial and business trade-offs that you're willing and not willing to make, then thinking about the principles and the processes that you have as a team, and then sort of building the personal connections. I think those would be like, at a high level, the 4 things that I would think about top of mind.
At some point, I think about performance a lot, personal performance, team performance. And at some point I created like a pyramid of performance. I said, okay, here's, this is the fundamental, here's where it all begins. And I think the first thing was just setting the right culture, right? Or having that, the culture of we want to achieve something, we want to deliver something, we want to create something. And then it kind of boiled down pretty much the way how you said it, right? From clarity, making sure that the leadership or whoever it is, setting the clarity for the team, communicating what's the vision that we're going towards, what's the day-to-day things that we're trying to achieve, what are the expectations, and then all the way down to the tactics and how do we groom our backlog, how do we create the tickets, how do we do code reviews, whatever it might be, right?
It's really interesting actually. So we've just hired a few people into the company, and one of the things that we consciously decided on is that the very first interview that we'll do for any role that we hire for is a culture fit interview. Because in the past I've often fallen trap, and I've been in teams that have fallen into a trap where there's always a really big demand for kind of like delivery resources, whether it be designers or engineers or QA testers or whatever it might be. And sometimes you find people that are exceptionally good at what they do, but they're exceptionally bad at how they do it, or what kind of impact they have on the team. And what ends up happening very often with hiring, I find, is that if you do all the technical assessments right at the start, the culture fit interview comes at the end. You've basically said the culture interview is almost like everyone's already bought in. There's already a sunk cost fallacy. There's already kind of like, we've already invested so much time in this person. We've validated they're going to be really good. There's a clear gap that they're going to come in and add value. And then the culture interview is like, but he feels like, or she feels like they're going to be a bit like painful. They're going to be a bit of a dick. And it's like, I'm not sure. I'm sure they're going to be fine. We'll figure it out. And that almost always like never works out well. So make sure that you actually have like the culture interview first. Make sure that, the people that you're speaking to, they're aligned to the way that you want to operate and how you want to like behave as a team, and make sure that first and foremost that is something that everyone agrees on, and that's something that's really clear with a potential candidate coming in, and only then do we then go on and test the technical skills. And so far I think it's actually been incredibly helpful and powerful, because also the ramp up time for people that then land in your organization will hopefully be a lot shorter, because hopefully they can hit the ground running much faster, because you've already made sure that they value similar sort of principles that you've already tried to integrate into how the business works.
Yeah. I was aggressively nodding because I've 100% been in that situation before. We made that exact mistake for those exact same reasons. You're like, culturally we're not sure, but they're really good at what they're doing, so I'm sure it's going to be fine. And it's almost never fine. So I think that makes so much sense. Do you have any favorite sort of interview questions that you think are very good that you like to ask? I've learned one good one recently that I want to start using. So I'm going to share that first, which is, you ask the candidate, what if assuming that you get hired and everything works out perfectly well in the role, what are you doing 6 months from now? Like, what's your day to day? What's your role? What's your job title? What's your salary? Tell me in detail what are you doing 6 months from now? And then what are you doing, say, 5 years from now? And the reason why I think it's a good question is because assuming that they know what they actually want, it gives you a good picture of what's important to them. It gives you a good picture of what's, the things that they highlight in that question are probably the things that matter to them, while the things that they don't highlight are probably things that are less important to them, right?
This is interesting, Matisse, because actually I disagree with you really strongly.
Okay.
So yeah, let's go. I think this is a really interesting conversation. So I think that all questions that are to do with how someone is going to estimate their future behaviors or future kind of like state of mind are incredibly valuable. There's a book,
right?
Yeah, because it's always aspirational, right? Yeah. And so there's two quotes that kind of come to mind. I think one is James Clear, which is, we often don't rise to the level of our goals, but we fall to the level of our systems, which is, people might aspirationally have these really grand ideas of where they want to be, but they might not necessarily have the infrastructure or the systems or the habits to get them there. And secondly, there's this amazing book that I've read when I was younger that's still stuck with me to this day called Stumbling on Happiness by Dan Gilbert, which basically is a psychologist's view of here's like all these different ways that I'm going to be happy when doesn't work. And it's absolutely incredible. I highly recommend you check out that book. But yeah, future-based like predictions to me feel really ineffective, I think, in interview questions. So yeah, I'm curious to hear more from you.
No, I agree. And as a product manager, I would never ask a customer, what would you do? I would always ask a customer, how have you solved this in the past, right? Yeah. Always learn based on past experience. Maybe to add a little bit to, why I think that question is a good question. I've only learned about it and I thought it was a good idea and I'm going to test it out in my next interviews. But I think it's less about what that person actually wants to achieve. It's more about what are the things that are important to them. Are they going to talk about the title? Are they going to talk about the fact that they're managing a team? Are they going to talk about the things that they're going to learn? And it gives you an idea of what is probably important to them and what, once they join your company, what should you probably help them, in which areas you should support them the most.
So I think that's a really good question, but I would ask it in the inverse. So one thing that I really like about Sequoia is their whole idea of kind of like crucible moments, which is like these big and like inflection points in like a personal or like a company's journey, where it's like, this fundamentally shifts the trajectory in a very different way. And I think asking the question in the opposite direction, which is like, what would you say are the, one or two biggest turning points that you've had in your career, and why were they turning points for you? I think that is actually, to some extent for me, much more interesting, because they actually have some real data to look back on. And also it kind of shows you how reflective and introspective that person is, which is, I think, for anyone who you want to be, has a growth mindset, naturally introspection is a big part of that. So even how they think about that and what they communicate there, and, well, I went from this job to that job, and, I doubled my salary, and that was really important to me because I was able to do X, Y, Z, is actually really indicative of you being able to ask an interesting follow-up question, which is just like, okay, well then, what kind of salary jump are you looking for now? And is that still important to you, or has something else now become important to you? So I think looking backwards and trying to ask a similar question, to me, actually feels a lot more interesting.
That makes sense. I love that you challenged me on that. I think in general on podcasts, we agree too much with each other, and I'm super guilty of that. I'm like agreeing way too much. So I love it that for once somebody disagreed with me, and I hope that happens more often.
Awesome. Glad that it was well received.
No, 100%, yeah. Okay, any other questions that you would highlight that you like to ask?
So
if there's anything that you feel like is interesting to share, otherwise we can, continue with some other subjects.
So I think that behavioral questions tend to do really well. I think one book that a really good friend of mine recommended was Hiring for Attitude by, I think it's Mark Murphy. And in that, basically, it kind of laid out the foundation of how I think we try to design our interview process at Calliper. And it was really around, define the behaviors within your organization that make you unique. And don't think about those behaviors as kind of like aspirational things. Think about them as like, what are key moments in your company, over the last kind of like 18 months that people remember in their head. Why do they remember those moments? How did people behave? And that tells you that what you actually chose to prioritize or how you actually behaved rather than what you wish you were. So it's a little bit more, I guess, grounded in past performance and reality to some extent. Mm-hmm. So then once you kind of have your cultural values, or once you have your behaviors, then identify behavioral questions that you can ask around that. So for example, one of the most important values for us at Calliper is a value of like win together, harness the greatness in others. So a question that I really like asking off the back of that is, could you tell me about the best team that you were in your career to date? Uh-huh. And then it's like, okay, what attitudes did that team have? What behaviors did that team have? How did that team reward like different behaviors? And so because we value teamwork, asking questions around that is really helpful, because then you get to try and find that cultural fit and that cultural analysis. So yeah, we've got 5 other values. We wrote a culture deck, and then we try to think really crucially around, what are 2 or 3 behavioral questions that we can ask to really help us dive deep on that. And I have to do a shout out to Brett Putter, who really helped with a bunch of the thinking here as well, who's a fellow founder friend.
Nice. I made a note of that. I think that's a good one. Right. Okay. So we touched quite a bit on frameworks, but I know that you're big on frameworks. So is there any other, how should I ask this? Is there any other framework that you think is very fundamental in the way how you function, or in the way, in business or life, something that you rely on often, or maybe not so often, but it makes a huge difference?
Yeah, I think honestly, it's really hard to think of generic frameworks off the top of head. Is there a particular kind of area of life or area of business that you're curious about? And I'll try and dig through my mental treasure chest of frameworks and bring something out. Otherwise, I feel like I might be grasping at straws.
Yeah, I know. It's a weird question to ask. I realized as soon as I asked it that it's it's hard to just, because it's usually the frameworks, you have them when you're faced with a problem, right? Or when you're in a certain situation, like, okay, here's the situation that we have and we need to solve it, and what's the framework that we apply to that? Maybe let me change the question. Do you
actually, Matisse, can I have a quick rant? I think this would be interesting.
Yeah.
So I was chatting. I went to dinner with 2 friends on Friday, and we had a long chat. And one of the most interesting parts of our conversation was LinkedIn and Twitter and how everyone's giving out advice. And there's a quote from Carl Jung that I really love, which is, beware of unearned wisdom, which I think is really, really interesting, especially in this kind of modern age where everyone's trying to build a brand around adding value. But then due to the nature of the internet, we're all seeing different things and reposting things and, recycling a lot of ideas and a lot of concepts from other people. And I think it becomes really challenging, right? Because it's not about, do you remember the right framework? But do you understand it from first principles, and can you apply it at the right time in the right way? Because especially in product management, there's 1,000,001 decision-making frameworks that you can choose in lots of different areas, whether it be product discovery, product delivery, growth, product growth, all this kind of stuff. But can you pick the right framework at the right time, and can you actually explain it to people in a simple, believable, understandable way from first principles, such that everyone can actually embrace it and buy into it, not just kind of go, okay, yeah, this seems like a sensible framework, let's go with it. But no one's really, because you've presented it as a framework, no one really wants to challenge it, rather than because they've really bought into it, which is also, I think, a real interesting challenge in teams. So yeah, slight diversion there, but I thought you'd like that.
No, I agree. And that was going to be my sub-question there. I was like, how do you actually pick the right framework to work on? Because one thing that I struggle with, so I have a folder, for example, whenever I find something interesting, and when I say, framework, sometimes it can be I guess a mental framework, how you think about something, and sometimes it's some sort of chart or sometimes we manage to, I guess, graphically represent them really nicely, and I love to collect those, and I have a folder with those kind of frameworks because it helps me understand how something functions. But I think one thing that I often struggle with, then you have all these tools at your disposal, and you don't necessarily think of the right thing when you're in a situation where you need it. I wonder if you solved that problem. I think that's a problem that I in general have, right? You have all these notes from the books, and you have all these resources, but they're not necessarily in the right place at the right time.
Yeah, it's like how do you index that kind of like system, and then like how do you then search for that system in the right way at the right time? I think is a really interesting and difficult question, but I'd say that like Occam's razor is probably like a really powerful thing, especially in, I think, like pre-product early stage companies, which is, the simplest answer is often the right one, or at least in kind of like startup land, it might not be the right one, but it's a good place to start. So let's go out there, let's, try it, get some data, learn, and then we can pivot and iterate afterwards. But let's not spend too much time maybe like over hypothesizing on like very limited data and very limited insights. Let's go with what we think is the simplest answer or the simplest solution, and then iterate from there.
Okay, that makes sense. I want to come back to something that I remember. I made a note of something in your operating manual.
Sure.
And you said one of your common frustrations is using the wrong mental models when evaluating people. For example, I think I didn't write down the whole thing, but I think, for example, it was like fame and some accomplishments that are not necessarily accomplishments. What is the opposite of that, or like what do you think is the right mental model when evaluating people? Because we evaluate people. We talked about it a little bit before, so maybe your answer is the same. When you're hiring, sometimes you just meet someone and you're trying to make sense of them, or you're trying to figure out, is this a credible person? Is this somebody I want to work with? So I wonder if you have the right approach or the right mental model there, or several of them.
Yeah, so I think where this came from at the time was, and I think it's still true, that very often, as humans, we have so much data flowing in at us across all different, parts of our life, from social media to kind of like work emails. So there's like an influx of like constant data that feels like it's increasing. The number of notifications that we receive tends to only like trend up unless you like actively battle it. And I think from that point of view, especially when it comes to people, we often just like look for really simple oversimplifications and kind of like frameworks around like, is this person, did they like work at like a fan company? Did they go to a good university? Etc., etc. So I think that very often we have these established mental models of like, quickly evaluating whether someone's like worth talking to or not talking to. And I feel like sometimes it's really worth questioning whether you should approach stuff in that way. Because I feel like sometimes the most richest and the most interesting interactions and conversations that you have are from people who have come from the most like weird path or like non-logical path that you can't trace. I often find that, people that have switched jobs around or have worked in different countries or have worked in different industries have much kind of like more interesting, richer stories and insights than people who have taken a much more traditional, prestigious kind of like path. And I think both are really good, just in different ways. And I think it's that kind of comment there was much more that, especially as like the volume of shit that we need to process increases, I think it's like as a call out to hold yourself up to a standard where, sometimes it's worth looking past that and thinking about stuff a little bit differently. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah, I think that makes sense. Yeah. And also reminded me of, there's another interview question that I think I picked that up from Elon Musk. I think that he talked about it. He said that he always asks people what were some of the most difficult problems that they had to solve. And then when the person tells them what that problem was, he dives deep. He goes as far as possible with sub-questions until the person doesn't know how to answer anymore. Which I think is really interesting because, very often if you look at somebody's kind of on the surface accomplishments, right? It's like, well, okay, if your, I don't know, CV or online profile is well designed, you're going to have a lot of accomplishments, right? But are you really responsible for them?
Yeah.
Or were you just, a small part of the team that accomplished that? And that can make a big difference, right?
Yeah.
And that, if we come back to, I suppose we're more in the talking about interviewing for a role or something similar. I think that's a very good question to ask. And again, a question that maybe sometimes we're almost afraid to ask. Like you're like, okay, I don't want to dive too deep, etc., etc. But when you, again, it's one of those things. If you don't ask it in the beginning, you probably regret it later on. So it's better to just really do it.
100%. I think that's a great question, and just keep trying to drill down from first principles is really powerful and really helpful. But I think also it's one of those really interesting things when you think about different cultures, because I would say that Americans tend to be a lot better at kind of crafting this is what I did and this is the impact that I have, and I think generally tend to be much better at sales, and I think that's something that we had a really interesting moment. So we raised our round from Sequoia, and we were part of this kind of ARC program. We had a kickoff with 16 other companies in London, and one of the
was that with Calliper?
Yeah, with Calliper, and we had a presentation from one of the Sequoia partners, and he basically asked the question of something to the effect of who here is going to build $1 billion business, and no one put their hand up. And it was quite funny, right? Because all of us in the room on an individual basis, it's I'm definitely going to try and I'm here to give it all that I can. But to some extent, I think sometimes those really, sometimes those statements that just don't come off very well in European cultures. I think modesty and kind of humility are actually qualities that, just culturally seem to be much more important. And I think that, even in London, I think sometimes when people say things like that, they come across more as egotistical than ambitious. And there's kind of a little bit of cultural fine tuning. And the further east you go, I guess in real Asian cultures, from my time in Hong Kong, the focus on we as a collective is so much more important. And I guess even having a little bit of tolerance and understanding around that, I think helps you really discount or different people's answers and different people's approaches as you kind of speak to people from different backgrounds.
That makes sense as well. That makes a lot of sense. Let's talk a little bit more about Calliper. We actually haven't really touched on it almost at all. So you learned you raised from Sequoia, which I didn't even know. And Sequoia, if anyone doesn't know, is one of the most respected venture capital firms from Silicon Valley, right? Calliper. For a start, can you just explain a little bit what it is? You mentioned briefly in the beginning, but maybe we can go a little bit more into the product and what it is.
Yeah, sure. So basically, I'll do a little bit of the origin story if you're interested.
Yeah.
So prior to starting Calliper, I guess I've spent 2-3 years working as an interim head of product or chief product officer with a bunch of different companies. And a lot of the time, I guess my job was to kind of come in, to parachute in and really very quickly try and triangulate what's happening in the company, what's working, what's not working, what are the real challenges that we have versus the challenges that we believe we have, but actually, not that seismic, and what are the things hiding around the corner that could really create an impact for us. And, sometimes it was team challenges, sometimes it was technical challenges, sometimes it was, user experience and customer development challenges. But fundamentally, what I found to be really helpful in all those kind of circumstances is that as soon as you were able to bring people together in a room and look at data together, we were able to kind of cut through the noise and cut through the bullshit of people's opinions and prejudice much faster. And kind of that was at the heart of what started Calliper, in that we're trying to build a system that makes data accessible and actionable for every team. And what that looks like is that we're building a mission control center where we're building integrations into all the common SaaS tools that every early stage technology company uses. So, Stripe for payments, Xero for accounting, Intercom for customer support, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of standard tools that we've kind of all seemed to gravitate towards. So we connect via API into those tools. We then have a bunch of data science, processes to kind of clean that data, to aggregate that data, to transform that data, and then we present that into like one mission control center where you can have an overview of all the critical health metrics that are running your system, and then we're building a collaborative interface on top of that, so cross-functional teams can have a much easier way to communicate around metrics. And where this really came from is that it's not just kind of helpful in terms of, strategy and process and people, just in terms of like building a more agile organization, but also kind of like on a personal individual level, especially during COVID, one of the key things that we found is that people feel quite disconnected from the work that they're having and from the impact that they're having. So if you can go into an organization and say, hey, as an organization, these are the 5 key metrics or KPIs that we really care about, and you as an individual can say, hey, this feature that I'm designing, or these customers that I'm supporting with, this is like I'm delivering work against like this thing that the company really cares about. It provides a much easier way for people to understand the impact that they're having in an organization and feel much more connected to their work, which is kind of like a secondary personal kind of like soft benefit that we've sort of discovered, but it's something that's actually become really much more pronounced and much more clear as we've been interviewing customers recently that are doing remote work. So yeah, it's all about bringing people and data together, and we have a few interesting ways to kind of do that.
All right. And interesting, one pattern that I see quite often is a lot of people who I haven't on the podcast, their business is actually solving their own problem, right? And those basically your case as well. You had this experience coming into businesses, seeing that pattern and just wanted to solve that for yourself. Can you tell me, how did you approach building an MVP for this? And as a follow-up question, at what point did you raise funding? And another follow-up question. Okay. How did you raise from Sequoia, or how did you get Sequoia on board? I imagine it must be hard.
Yeah, so I'd say, we were very lucky and fortunate with Sequoia. We had like a pretty long fundraising process, and we never really thought that we'd be able to kind of like raise from them, but sort of the stars aligned. I was very fortunate to have an old friend who joined there as a partner, who accepted kind of like an initial meeting, and then as we kind of got to meet the rest of the partners and told more of our story, this kind of whole space of like collaboration and data feels to be like a very ripe market to be in. And I guess for context, as a team, I have all this experience from product, and my co-founder James has really rich experience in data science. He helped set up a data science function within a large SaaS PE fund. And so basically he went into 20 or so different portfolio companies of that PE fund and set up a lot of like core data capabilities within all of those kind of companies. So, 10 million plus revenue businesses. So I guess between us, we had like a really interesting picture of, what are the challenges that really get in the way of teams being able to leverage data in a more authentic and a more useful way within the organizations to build more agile and robust organizations. And I'd say probably that was the thing that I think gave us the most kind of like bonus points, I would say, just having that real founder product market fit. I'd like to think. Obviously you'd have to speak to them and all the other investors that we raised from for their side of the story. But I think from us, that's probably one of the core things that I think probably stood out. So I think that answers one of your questions, but you asked 3. So the previous question was, how did we approach building MVP?
Yeah. And then at which point did you raise funding?
Yeah, so in this iteration of Calliper, where we've kind of really focused on this, we started working with James, my co-founder, full-time in January. So I'd say that from January to March was all around customer development, customer research, and really trying to like dig deep and understand what is holding people back from actually building more data-driven organizations. And it's really hilarious, right? Because every single founder that I've spoken to so far, you ask them like, do you feel like you're data-driven? And it's always like, not really. I think we can do better. And actually, I really want to do better. Okay, so like, what's stopping in the way? And so we spent a lot of time speaking to a lot of founders and a lot of operators to really understand what's going wrong. And then we kind of realized that largely it's an accessibility problem from our point of view. So most of the prototype that we built was actually Figma based. We said that, hey, we feel like data is actually, this is much more of a data science and a design challenge than it is an engineering challenge, at least for now, until we kind of reach a large scale. So let's tackle the most kind of like the point of most differentiation and the point where we think we can add the most value first. And so we ended up kind of building a pretty complete Figma prototype. We did a Loom video around it. We shared that with a bunch of kind of like people that we did customer research with. We got some really good feedback. And I think the momentum of that really helped us then kind of like accelerate our fundraising process. And then we really started building like the core engineering only at the start of the summer, if not the middle of the summer, as we then, worked a little bit with an agency and then now have our own kind of like core engineering team where we're really starting to like accelerate with product development.
Okay, I see, makes sense.
Does that cover all three, or have I missed anything?
I think that covers all three. Yeah, that covers all three. And what's the plan for the future now?
Yeah, so at the moment, I guess the key focus for us is really trying to define what is MVP. And I think it's more challenging than it sounds. And I think people always like throw the term MVP around. And it means very different things for like, many different people. But for us, we've kind of defined what kind of like, obviously as a data company, we've thought through like what are like the metrics that we want to track off the back of our product to indicate that we've found product love. And then what features do we think are necessary for us to kind of like achieve that in order to launch something that's usable. So right now we've got like a really dirty MVP that we're testing with people, and it's really quite embarrassing. But in terms of our kind of like more end-to-end experience, we're thinking around what's nice to have versus what's essential. And because it's a collaboration product, and we want to be able to like invite your whole team and have like all these interactions on top of the data, and we want to make it holistic, so it's like a mission control for your entire business. Like there's like a lot of vectors to try and triangulate. So we've picked financial metrics and growth metrics as kind of like the start and the end of the customer journey as like the key integrations that we start with, and then we've defined a couple of key collaboration kind of like workflows that we want to have within the product. But we're now testing ourselves around whether those are too complex or not complex enough, or where is that kind of line. And also there's a lot of hygiene factors around, obviously data security, user access controls. Not everyone wants their kind of like, spend data and revenue data to be visible to every employee. So there's a whole bunch of hygiene stuff that we also need to get right. So I've got to be honest with you, it's like probably one of the more meatier MVPs that we're kind of like working on, but we're kind of hoping that within the next couple of months we'll really have a kind of like minimal lovable product that then we can kind of co-create and really develop with a handful of customers. But what's probably most important for us right now is picking those early design partners really carefully and working very closely with them to try and create some kind of transformation within their business around being more data driven, being more aligned, and figuring out what are the right metrics that we need to track from a, I guess, like culture and collaboration point of view to be able to have strong signals that we are actually creating a positive change. And then from there, once we have a formula that works, how do we then go and expand? But yeah, I'd have to say one of the things that's like definitely keeping me up at night right now is, picking the right design partners for this, and also making sure that we have the right level of fidelity in terms of features to be able to have at least a fair representation of what we think the product can be. So yeah, really long brain dump there, but I guess this is all top of mind as a founder at the moment. So
yeah. No, I think so. That's actually just what I was thinking about. You said you need to pick the right design partners, right? Because I guess eventually you want to have a lot of different integrations, right? But all those integrations take a lot of time and resources to build. 100%. So that's a tricky part with the kind of product that you're building, right? So I guess you're just gonna have to figure out, is it certain type of company or certain segment or certain size that's a perfect match for just that minimum amount of integrations that it really solves a big problem for them, right?
Yeah, so I think our working hypothesis at the moment is that, SaaS companies with about 15 to 30 employees who've, kind of broken through the 10K MRR mark and, using the core tools that we currently have integrations with, which is like, Google Analytics, Stripe, and soon kind of like Xero. That feels like companies of that kind of profile make a lot of sense to us for a variety of reasons. But then on top of that, there's like a really interesting question around what is like the behaviors or the traits of the leadership team of those companies. Do we want people who are already very data driven and are looking for better ways to be able to access that, more accessible way to then spread that kind of like focus of metrics to the whole company? Or do we want to find people who are like actually not very sophisticated at all, and this is then a stepping stone? And I think there's like a couple, and then, do we want people who have very transparent organizations, or do we want people who are like very like command and control top down? And so actually, I think this is something that I haven't really heard many people talk about in the B2B space, which is, it's not just about the shape of the organization and the stage of the organization, but what is also the, shall we say, demographic profile of the persona that you're targeting within the business, which is, whether it be, head of sales or head of operations or, like team engineer or principal engineer. I think that there's so many different ways to try and like triangulate. And I think it's quite interesting to think about what are the trade-offs that you're making when you lean one way or another, or does it even matter? Do you even need to be conscious of that to begin with? More questions than answers there, but all interesting exploration for us right now.
Yeah, well, that's how it is at this stage, right? You got a lot of questions and you need to explore to find the answers to those. And yeah, I think it is interesting because there's different decision makers in the company, right? And who's the person that needs to discover you, but who's then the person who ultimately makes the decision that your tool is necessary, right? It's not that those two are often not the same people, very often. Especially, the larger the company, the less likely it is that those two will be the same people, right?
And there's a third challenge here, which is also who actually has management access to all the tools to be able to allow us to connect the APIs and actually do that. So there's an implementation as well. So quite a few different stakeholders, quite a few different challenges to map out. But yeah, all fun and games at the moment, really doing customer research and testing out the product with some early customers and trying to figure out who is that right design partner, because I feel like the insights and kind of like the habits that you build with those early customers will really can tremendously change the direction of your business. And I think people don't often realize that those 2 to 5% direction changes in the trajectory at the start can land you in a very different place in kind of 6 to 12 months time.
So you want to be very careful who is that person, or who are those companies that you work with.
Exactly.
At an early stage. Cool. Okay. Not to go on for too long, I think we're going to wrap up at this point. Is there anything else that you think we forgot to talk about?
Let's see your list. So frameworks, operating models. We haven't touched psychedelics. And we actually, and we haven't touched, I guess, have we touched high performance enough? Is there other aspects?
I'd love to talk more. If you think you have more to say about that, I'd love to talk more. I have a few episodes where we basically talk just about that. And the most downloaded episode ever was the one where we mostly just talked about high performance. And I loved it. And looks like the listeners loved it as well. So if you got more material, let's dive more into that.
Yeah. So one thing that maybe it's worth... I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well. But over the weekend, I was trying to think around... what is a hygiene checklist that I can make for myself around burnout? Because I feel like understanding what pace you want to operate at and how long you want to sustain that pace is, I think, a really important question. But then creating the feedback loops when you kind of go off track to really understand, are we on the right trajectory and the right velocity here? Or do I need to actually take an aggressive kind of action to course correct here, whether it be taking a holiday, taking the day off, even potentially stopping the sprint and changing what you're doing. Yes. I think, thinking about pace and how long you want to maintain that for, and then what are the ways that you actually measure and monitor, I think are two really important things that are also top of mind recently.
I just had a friend staying here, the guy that I mentioned before, one of my closest friends, and he had, in 3 years, he had 3 burnouts, which is insane. It made me think so much. We talked a lot about it. He was staying at my place for a week, and we talked a lot about that. He just kind of got over now the final burnout, and I can already see how he's also an overperformer type of guy, and he's already getting involved into so many things. I was like, dude, just be careful. Just be careful. Don't let this happen to you again, because it's bad. And I don't know what is the word that you used? What's the sort of checklist of things, or how do I keep myself in check? I'm not entirely sure. But one thing that I do is I'm very strict about the fundamentals that I think keep you healthy, I suppose. Getting enough sleep.
Yep.
Regularly doing sports. eating very healthy. I think those are the three things that I really prioritize in my life and are always one of my top priorities. I don't think that's enough, but I think that gives you very healthy fundamentals, and everything else is easy on top of that, right? If you have a healthy body and healthy spirit, I think it's easier to not burn out, or it's less likely to burn out. The other thing is, which I suppose I'm quite lucky. I don't know enough about the actual science of burnout, but what I hear from people is that you burn out when you are frustrated and you don't see the way out, right? When you're in a situation and you're not sure how to get yourself out of it. What's the solution here?
Yeah.
And when you're in that kind of situation for an extended period of time, that's what gets you to burn out. Yeah. I'm lucky that most of my life, and also currently, even though I do a lot of different things, I genuinely really, really enjoy everything that I'm doing. And
awesome.
If I ever feel like there's no way out, that's usually a very short period of time. That's like an hour when I'm like, oh my God, this is a disaster. But then I go for a walk and, breathe in, breathe out. And I'm like, okay, cool. Here are some things that we can try. Let's do that. I think those are my thoughts, but I think about it a lot because I think like yourself, I think a lot in frameworks, and I think a lot about prevention, right? How can I try to prevent something disastrous before it happens?
Yeah.
And I think a burnout, especially if you're a bit of a workaholic and ambitious and, you get yourself into a lot of different things, a burnout is a very, very realistic thing that can happen to you, right? It's not something that's just out there. You are quite consciously exposing yourself to the chance of burning out. So I think about it often. I don't know. What do you think?
So I completely agree with you on the point around, making sure that your kind of like daily hygiene practices around, sleep, nutrition, exercise, I think are all good. I think one of the interesting challenges that I find sometimes is that in points of extreme stress or extreme kind of like pressure, that just doesn't seem to cut the mustard anymore. And so then like what are like the pull cord instead of in case of emergency type activities, or like use hammer to break glass, because I find that one thing that so I really enjoy sport, but sometimes I find that when I get really stressed I work out even harder, but then there's only so much that you can refill the tank with that, and then you need to find a new way to kind of like top up the tank. And I think it's really interesting and important to kind of like have a little bit of self-awareness, but also maybe having a couple of things like pre-planned around what those things could be. So, going out for a walk in nature, taking, a Saturday off to go to like an art gallery or to kind of like a music event or something like that. But I'm really conscious to basically have in my pocket a couple of things that I can pull out as almost like, joker cards where like, play this if the situation gets really bad. Because I do also feel that like over time, we just normalize and habituate so many things. So the level of efficacy that you get out of these kind of habits over time does stagnate. And I found even with my meditation practice, I've had to switch things up sometimes because stuff just isn't really getting me to the right level of like deep peace and concentration so it's not then having the same benefit, even though I'm doing the thing. And that can actually become really frustrating where you're looking at yourself, it's like, but I'm doing all the right things. I'm looking after myself the way that normally worked, but all of a sudden it's not working there. And I found myself sometimes in that kind of trap where those things, because I see that they're not working anymore, push me even further down the spiral because it's like, fuck, what am I going to do now?
Yeah. So you reminded me of two more things now when you were talking about this. One is one of my, I suppose, tricks or kind of extra things that I do is, and especially if I feel more stressed, I go to the sauna. And going to the sauna is the most relaxing thing. The feeling when you first stay in extreme heat for 15 minutes and then you go to a cold plunge for a minute or so and you come out and you just feel like, I don't know, in a different universe. And that to me, and then repeating that maybe 2 or 3 or 4 times, is extremely relaxing. And I'm just in a different state of mind when I do that. the other thing is, which I haven't completely figured out yet, but I'm determined to do so, is having somebody I can rely on, whether that's a coach or a therapist or somebody who, when I feel like, okay, this situation is shit and I'm not entirely sure what to do about it and I need to talk to somebody about it, somebody who I can message or call them and be like, dude, I need to talk to you today or tomorrow.
Yeah.
Like, we need to talk soon. But I may have a lead, and I'll tell you a quick story. So this same friend of mine who was staying with me now for a week, right? He, on Sunday, so that was this last Sunday, he also booked in a massage. He was like, yeah, I'm a little bit like,
nice.
I just want to, relax. And he Googled around and found this masseuse and went there, and he comes back home like 4 hours later or something. I'm like, dude, what happened? He's like, he comes into the flat and he's like, dude, I'm high. What? And he doesn't even do drugs. Like, he hasn't done any drugs for like 7 years or something. I'm like, what's happening? What happened? And so this masseuse guy, he's a master of many trades, right? So he does massage, but he was also a therapist, and he's a Reiki certified master. And when my friend came there to get a massage, the guy said, you look really stressed. Do you want a microdose of mushrooms? And and my friend was like, nah, I don't really do those things. But then they sat down and he was like, look, I do that very often, and it's really good for you, and it's so much better than taking like antidepressants, etc., etc. And he convinced him, and he took a microdose of mushrooms, and he was like, dude, this was the best therapy session I've ever had. And it was like massage / therapy session / I don't know what else were all the other things that the guy has thrown in the mix, but I was like, I'm definitely trying that.
In my product head, I'm like, bundling. Yes, bundling works. So that brings in mind like two really interesting things that I want to share back with you. I think one, speaking of frameworks, I think the best framework that I have around burnout is actually it's a 2x2 matrix of accountability and power or influence. So if you have high accountability but low power or influence, that's the point of burnout. So that's the point where I have this team that I need to support, but I can't seem to be close around fast enough, so we're going to have to make some layoffs, or potentially could be closing the company down, or we're not able to generate sales as quick as we want because it's an enterprise sales cycle and buying procedures, etc., etc. And so all those things where you're on the line for delivering, but it's outside of your control. That's the point where stuff gets really hairy for people. And then on the opposite side, if you have a lot of power, but you have low accountability, you're just bored. And that's not good either. So trying to find that right balance, and obviously if you have high accountability and high power and influence, that's a real kind of growth area. And then low of each is just I don't know what you're doing. You definitely need to change something. But I think that's a really interesting framework to kind of think around, also spheres of influence, this is within my control, this is within my influence, this is completely outside of my control.
Yeah. How much do you think there's mindset involved in that as well? Because sometimes I feel see, again, I don't know how much, if you burn out, how much that's due to just your psychology or genetics or what are all the factors. And I'm sure there's a lot of different factors, right?
Yeah.
But I work with some people who are just extremely resilient, and that's just, I think, due to their mindset. The way how, even when there's something extremely stressful, and they're just no, man, it's fine. This is nothing, and we're going to solve it. And, just so chill about it. And I think partially, so I've been lucky. I've worked with a guy like that for several years now. And I think I picked it up a little bit. I think I got stressed way easier. And I'll tell another quick story. One of the fears I always had was, especially in business, was extremely upsetting somebody with my decisions, right? Because often as an entrepreneur, you don't really know what you're doing, and sometimes you fuck up. That's inevitable, right? And sometimes you're going to upset some people, and that would really throw me off. And now recently I had a situation where one of the projects that I'm working on, a competitor contacted us, and he was quite upset, and he was like, you're doing this and that's completely wrong. And for 10 seconds I was like, oh shit. But then after that I was like, maybe there's an opportunity in this. Let me try to turn this around. And we exchanged a few emails, and I turned it into a partnership afterwards. And I was like,
Nice.
this is the best thing ever. This is incredible. I
Jiu-jitsu.
can't, yeah, exactly.
Nice.
I was proud of myself. I was like, yeah, there we go. You've come a long way. But that's the difference, right? Because my old self would be like, oh my God, this is so bad. We just need to like stop immediately what we're doing. We upset someone. Probably we're doing something wrong, etc., etc. And that is just, I don't know, mindset and I guess experience as well, right?
Yeah, 100%. I really believe there's a lot of truth in that, in terms of like, you know, a growth mindset can like take you very far. I think the question is like, when you're really tired and really stressed and everything is kind of like against you, like how do you remind yourself of that? And how do you really kind of like embed that in yourself? Because also the other interesting thing that I found is that, I guess I've had like 3 burnouts in my career. One when I was 18, one when I was like 21, and one when I was like 23. The first one was probably like most intense and most severe. And yeah, I ended up kind of like collapsing at work and kind of woke up and had like my vision in my left eye had completely gone.
Wow.
And it was a bit terrifying because I'm like, wait, what the hell? I can't see right now. What's going on? And I went to the doctor, and you know, they did a quick diagnosis and they had to book me in for a CT scan. But they were like, look, to be honest with you, like my leading hypothesis here is that you've developed a brain tumor and it's pressing on your optic nerve. And I was just like, 18-year-old me's like, what the fuck? And I was just like completely taken aback by all of this, and ended up kind of just being like so much stress and pressure. And kind of at that point, I was working 18-hour days back to back, you know, for 2 or 3 months. And honestly, my body was just kind of like shutting down. And after 10 days of kind of like off time, you know, I slowly kind of like regained vision and stuff like that, and everything sorted itself out. But what I realized is that then, and maybe this is because something, the way that I'm programmed, but the next time that I burnt out was something completely different. And also, that level of work intensity didn't do it. It was something else that kind of like broke me. And then the third time it was something completely different. So you end up kind of like keep pushing within this space, but you don't know where the critical failure will come from sometimes. So I think self-awareness is really important, and being able to like, you know, pull yourself out of that kind of like, you know, self-destructive, chaotic state is really kind of like powerful. But I think that also with psychedelics and with drugs and alcohol in general, one thing that I sometimes get a little bit scared by is that I speak for myself, and I also speak to a few other friends that I have in the startup world, where we have strong addictive personalities, and we're kind of like, you know, everything that we do is quite intense. And if you take that intensity with kind of like drugs or alcohol or any other kind of behavior, do you end up actually then like, you know, trumping something bad with something else that's also not really healthy and restorative? And I find that is actually really challenging, because sometimes the only way to kind of like stop the chatter is to do something really intense, because then you kind of force your mind to like completely go in the other direction. So for me, it was like, you know, before it was, you know, doing triathlons or like ultra long running, where, you know, you're running for like 2 hours. You can't really afford to think about work in the last 2 hours, because your body's just like, you know, trying to force yourself to carry on going. Or like, you know, you're trying to like squat really heavy, and if you're not thinking about your form and stuff like that, you're going to injure yourself. But so you can only like really change. What am I trying to say here? It's almost, I guess, like thermodynamics. Energy can't really be created or transformed. It can only like it can't be created or destroyed. It can only be transformed. So maybe you just need to find something that's just as intense to kind of like, you know, switch out of work mode. But then that can sometimes be really dangerous and challenging as well, especially with the personality types that some of us entrepreneurs have. So yeah, lots of stuff there, but I think it's that self-awareness and how do you pull yourself out, and then what is the remedy that you have for yourself is really interesting, because yeah, psychedelics and drugs, I've also seen take people in a very dangerous path.
They certainly can. And you're right, most of us are intense, and most of us like to have intense people around us, right? That's, I don't know. I don't know about you, but for me, that just gives me, I don't know, life. That gives me some feeling of being alive, I suppose. But you're right, I agree. You know, one activity that's similar for me is go-karts. Well, that's low risk, very simple to do, but it's competitive in a good, very healthy way, I suppose. So you just go with a group of friends, and for those, I don't know, whatever, few minutes when you're on the track, you just, I don't know, my mind is 100% just on the track. There's nothing else that I can think about, right? So that's one. I think I tried wakeboarding in the past, but I think it was less effective. It's easier to like just get distracted. I don't know. You're not so much focused on it, I suppose. I think I have another thing. A friend of mine does martial arts. So that's also a good one, because if you you know, you got to be there, otherwise you get punched in the face. So
Exactly. Yeah.
So that's also a good one. And yeah, I think maybe that's also a good option to just do that probably more regularly. I don't do it very regularly, but maybe I should, or maybe it would be just good and fun as well. I mean, most of those things you do them because it's also fun, right?
Yeah, I think like an element of fun is really essential. Just because then I think it feels a lot more restorative. But yeah, figuring out like, you know, what is the feedback loops that you have for yourself to kind of tell you when you're starting to like veer into like dangerous territory, and how do you course correct, and having some thinking through some stuff like this, like saunas, like you mentioned, and go-karting, you know, that massage plus like psilocybin plus whatever else, that also sounds really great. But yeah, having those things probably in your back pocket, that, you know, you have a really easy way to kind of like a frictionless way to activate those, I think probably is really important. But I think maybe just to kind of like circle back to something that we mentioned earlier that I also wanted to share, which is something that we talked about within Calliper as a team, is what's the kind of intensity that we want to bring to every week. I think there's what we kind of like decided on, or what I strongly believe in for us as a company, is like we want to operate every week to be like around 80% of max capacity, and then be very selective and very intentional as a team to say, this is like, you know, it's time to kick it up a gear for a short period of time to get this over the line. And really, like, you know, we're going to go into like 120 for the next couple of weeks, and just make that really intentional and really clear to the team. Because I also feel like as a team, it's really important to understand and just kind of like normalize, what are we doing, right? Because if someone is like, you know, pushing really hard and they're working, running away every Saturday and Sunday, how sustainable is that? And does that actually make other team members feel like they're not pulling their weight, they're not doing enough? And how do you actually then check in with that person to really make sure that they're not burning out? And trying to kind of have like a velocity blueprint for the team, and figuring out how do we calibrate on what that looks like, is also something that I think is really important. It's something we have an onboarding week with everyone in London at the end of September. And I think this is going to be an interesting topic of conversation, because again, right, remote work, you don't actually know how long people are really working or how intensely they're working. Obviously, you have some proxies around, you know, sprint velocity, tickets, stand-ups, etc. But you never quite fully know. And, you know, some people could be like, oh my God, I saw that they're online on Slack for like, you know, 14 hours. They must be like, you know, working like crazy. Or alternatively, you know, it might be like, I barely saw this person online. But no, it's because they're doing deep work. And they're prioritizing, you know, some real focus time to get something over the line. So I think, again, going back to high performance of teams, how do you communicate and align as a team on what's the pace that you want to set as a team, or what that means, and what the expectations around that are also something that I think is really important. And again, this is just a working hypothesis or a mental model that I have, but something that I think is top of mind, especially to make sure that we don't have a team that burns out, especially as we're remote.
Is it the difference between, let's say, 80 and 120? Is that, how do you sort of measure that, or how do you have a sense of what's the intensity that you're having at any given moment? Because it's, well, as you kind of mentioned, it's hard to measure that. It's hard to, even if you try to measure that in hours, you can't really, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's a great question. I'd love to have a very clear answer for you. I don't think I do, but maybe some things that are top of mind for me are, first and foremost, like being specific with the outcome that you're pushing to with that intensity, right? So is it getting a specific feature over the line before an important deadline? And maybe then reverse engineering what that means and where we can cut scope or kind of like, quality maybe or maybe, where can we spend to be able to like bring in a external resource, or maybe like a Surface or a SaaS tool that can help us out. I think that's really helpful to sort of try and like reverse engineer, like what's the goal that's a specific goal that we can all clearly understand that we're going to try and reverse engineer. Because I think it's often like, customer or milestone related. So hopefully that would be a good way to think about it. But the other thing is that I'm hoping we're using Linear at the moment So Linear is like, imagine if Jira was redesigned and operated a lot more like Figma. That's kind of what Linear is. And I think for us, it's a really interesting tool that we're playing around with at the moment that has a lot of really nice, like sprint, they call sprint cycles, and they have this whole methodology. I recommend you check it out. It's really cool. We're happy customers. But within that, there's this whole thing around like velocity and like maintaining a steady velocity over cycles. So I guess in more tangible terms, maybe it's kind of saying, hey guys, we need to like, increase by 20 or 30% the number of points that we need to fit in to this next sprint to make sure that we move it forward. But yeah, those are probably like two ways that are top of mind of trying to communicate or sort of like push towards that. But I think the more important thing there is actually probably around actually managing expectations. There's something that I spent a bunch of time, I think, like I mentioned earlier, at BCG within their digital ventures team. Yeah. And when I was there, I got really fascinated by the world of management consulting, because I think before I got there, I heard all these amazing things about BCG, McKinsey, Bain, these really smart people that kind of like, come in and work with the CEOs and boards of like all these big companies around the world and solve these magical problems. And there's a lot of good, there's also a lot of bullshit. Like with any industry, it has its challenges, has its problems, has its really good aspects. But one thing that kind of got me really interested within the whole professional services space is thinking around the longevity that people have within certain roles within a position. And I read this really interesting article around the teams with, and I can't remember which management consultancy or strategy consultancy they looked at when they did this, but they basically tracked like a dozen different managers and then the retention of those managers over the course of like 2 or 3 years. And basically what they found through a set of interviews of people was that having predictability is one of the single most important things for like employee well-being and longevity in this kind of bit of research. And I think with all bits of research, it's to some extent oversimplification. But what they really talked about was that, as an individual, if I say that I want to go and do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or Krav Maga or whatever martial art on Tuesday because this is like my self-care hygiene time and it's something that's really important to me, how frequently does my boss come in and kind of, basically stop me from going and doing that? And so like how much predictability do I have around my time and how good is the management expectations of that? Because if I end up making all of these social plans with my partner, with myself around like my, training, my, like personal time, and all of my plans get aggressively cut every time and there's no respect of those boundaries and there's no predictability, that is a really big predictor for kind of like churn. And I always thought that was really interesting, right? So as a manager, how can you manage expectations around, hey, this is going to be a really busy period. Can we count on you to potentially put some personal items on the backlog? And we'll figure out how to then like bring the balance in after this busy period. But as a team, it's really important that we get this over the line. Can you commit to helping us like achieve this? And can you commit to like prioritizing the work that we need to do above other stuff that may be important to you? And I'm not sure if that's the right way of phrasing it. This is just off the top of my mind. Yeah. But directionally, hopefully that gives you a sense of where I think the conversation should be. What do you think, Mattis? How does that sit with you actually?
I think that makes a lot of sense. That makes sense to me too. I agree with the predictability aspect, and I can see how that can have consequences on somebody's life, like really painful consequences, right? Because there's stuff that you do outside of your work that's important to you, and maybe your friends are going to start looking down on you because you cancel the plans. Maybe your spouse is going to get upset. Maybe you don't spend much time with your kids, and that's important to you. Maybe you don't go to the gym that often, and that has an effect on your mental well-being, right? So I can totally see how that makes a difference if you're actually able to, I suppose, plan that and prepare for that. The other thing I was going to add is, I suppose it is hard to measure the intensity. And I think that over time you become better at just intuitively feeling what the intensity is that you're currently, the intensity at which you're currently moving at or pushing forward, right? You see, is it like, does it feel like insanely busy, or is it just like, normal busy?
Yeah.
Are you like really setting extremely high expectations, or just like normal high expectations? Do you get a lot of pushback from the team that, and they're telling you, this is not realistic, or you don't get that much pushback? So I think you start picking up on those kind of signals, and that gives you a sense of, okay, the intensity that you're at. I think that's how I probably measure it. So it's not super data driven, but it's more intuition driven in this case, and I suppose backed by this experience.
No, but I think that's totally valid, right? And I think what's really important is like the longer the amount of time that we work within a team in a set process, which is actually why I think agile as a methodology and a set of beliefs are really important to me. Which is, you have those rituals where you can do a retrospective, and hopefully over time you will grow and you'll become better and you'll become more attuned to what's working, what's not, and also be able to like actually shift gears where like, one of the biggest challenges that I think startups have is delineating between discovery and delivery. So like, is our job right now to go out and learn? At which point the measure of success should be the speed of learning, right? So it's like at the moment, we're testing a bunch of different infrastructure options. The rate that we test different infrastructure options should be a lot more valuable than the depth of the integration that we create there. And so that's what we're trying to prioritize versus, hey, this is delivery mode. We should judge ourselves based on the quality and the speed of our outputs. And I think those are two very different like ways of operating. And those two, it's really important to have a really clear distinction within the team, because also that's where stuff really goes astray, right? Which is like, hey, we think we have scoped this out really well and this is a delivery task. But actually, no, there were so many unknowns. It's actually a discovery task.
Yeah.
And do we have the trust and the communication within the team to say, hey, we said X, we actually discovered like 1, 2, 3, 4 things that completely invalidated the original assumptions of this ticket. We're now going to need to go out and create a whole bunch of discovery tasks to go out and figure out, how do we even think about these challenges? Because we're going in completely ignorant. As a team, do you reward that or do you punish that? Because, in your standard kind of like sprint methodology, we estimate something, the estimate was wrong, but this person's now created an extra task in the backlog. And again, like, what do you reward and punish? I think that's also a really crucial part of creating a high performance team, because ultimately that's what reinforces good or bad behavior. So in the medium to long term, if you're not careful with that, you might end up getting yourself in a really sticky situation. And going full circle, maybe in our conversation, going back to mindset, I think this is where like, Carol Dweck, the whole book mindset is so crucial, right? Because if you create an identity within, and I think she talks a lot about children, right? Within like, hey, you're so smart, you did so well in your kind of like test, and it was like, you did it so quickly, or your homework assignment. So now as a child, have I created an identity around, I'm only loved when I'm really smart and I do things really quickly and I get really good results. So, and I think that these kind of examples are not as pervasive, I think are not like direct corollaries within teams and organizations, but also something that you really should be mindful of. Like, do you reward people going out and actually discovering stuff and like the cadence of learning, or do you reward the quality of execution? So yeah, a bit of a long kind of like brain dump there, but I think again, lots of really important stuff that I think about in terms of high performing teams.
Yeah. What do you actually reward, and what do you actually have your team focus on? I completely agree.
So, question for you, maybe: how do you think about as a leader and kind of like some of the product functions that you have? How do you give credit to individual contributions in the team, and also how do you actually take credit for yourself where you need to?
How do I give credit? I think the answer is, mostly by just giving recognition to people, right? So if, I don't know, we ship something successfully, I'm like, well done, usually there's one person who kind of owns one feature or, put in most of the effort into one feature. I'm like, well done, very good job. And I'll often just show I don't know, maybe some metrics that we've achieved, or maybe feedback from a user, and I'll say, this is this is what we achieved. Good job. Recognition for myself. I wouldn't say that I'm extremely good at that, but, or at least, like, I guess, attracting recognition. I think it's important to show the results, but I don't know. That's a trickier question for me.
So the reason why I asked that is, I think, especially within product management, it's a really interesting gray area, right? Because technically it's kind of like servant leadership to some extent, which is like your job is to get the most out of the team, to create clarity, to create alignment, to remove bottlenecks, to help the team prioritize stuff. But very often you're not attached to the delivery. And I think it's similar as people get promoted. There's a phrase that I heard the other day that I really loved, which is sometimes a lot of the promotions in startup land are battlefield promotions, which is like, hey, you seem to be smart, you've done a good job at this level, we're now going to another level, like, the job is yours. You've kind of gone from like, sales exec to now like, head of sales. And I think it's really interesting as we kind of go into that next role, what do we have to like reprogram in our mind around where we measure our own value and self-worth and contribution? Because I think that personally, if I'm honest, that's something that I always kind of like struggled with within product management, where it's difficult to sometimes place your finger on where you're really adding value. And sometimes actually you get the pushback from teams, right, that are like, you're this connective tissue, but you're actually more of a blocker than an enabler. So, what are you actually doing to add value here? And I think especially in kind of like these battlefield promotions where we're kind of going from a operational role to a more managerial role and we're less connected to the day-to-day execution, how do we maybe even not like take credit within the team, but how do we actually validate our own the own value that we have within ourselves within the work that we do?
And I am more and more, the longer I do what I do, the more I feel that my main way to add value is by building a high-performing team. That's why I think about that quite a lot. I feel like everything else is less important. So yeah.
What would you say is like the biggest kind of like landmine to avoid that like jeopardizes high-performing teams? And what would you say is the most important thing on the other side of the spectrum that, is the highest leverage point for high-performance teams from your experience?
I'll start with the highest leverage point. Because that's what for me, I think I noticed that the highest leverage point is building the culture of performance. And I think that that's what I've done well in the past. Talking about what we're trying to achieve, talking about why we want to achieve that, understanding if, people who work on our team, if they also have that drive to achieve something, right? Or do they just want to get paid at the end of the month? Or do they actually want to grow as individuals, want to help the company to grow, want to learn something, want to create something, right? So I talk about that a lot, and I often talk about the importance of that. Just, this is who we are. This is what we're here for. We want to achieve, and we're proud of that, and we show results, and we want to keep showing results, and that's just who we are. So building that culture and that identity of we perform and we get stuff done. In terms of the landmines, I would say maybe two things. One is, I think the biggest landmine is probably having a team member who doesn't fit into that culture. Somebody who's, if somebody is way behind everyone else and they don't actually enjoy the high performing kind of spirit and they don't enjoy getting stuff done, I think that drags everyone else behind, and it seems unfair to everyone else, and it just lowers that bar of the expectations and the what we're trying to achieve. So that's probably number one. Number two is probably just frustrating your team. So I think when you have people who deliver, I think it's important to understand, and that's hard. And I'm not gonna say that I'm really good at that. Maybe I am. I don't know, honestly. I try to be, but I think it's hard. understanding what kind of environment do they thrive in, and what do they want to work on, and what do they think that's important, and trying to provide that for them, assuming that it's aligned also, I suppose, with with your worldview and with what you think should be prioritized. Because obviously, if you frustrate somebody, they're going to leave, and especially if they are actually high performers and they want to deliver, but they feel like you're just a barrier to them, then they're just going to leave, go somewhere else, right?
Yeah, I think that the point around, I really agree with what you said around, what really matters, and that whole point around identity. And I think, so two things that I researched when we kind of started our recruitment process that I think is like quite interesting from Stripe. One is I read an interview from the Stripe founders, it was actually a senior employee at Stripe that basically said, the identity of most people that you interact with at Stripe are like Hermione Grangers from Harry Potter, which I thought was actually like really funny, and kind of like, regardless of what you think about like Harry Potter and Hermione Granger as like an archetype, I thought it was really interesting that they had been able to kind of point out as like, this is a persona or a character that a lot of people in the organization identify with. And that's something that like really made me think, which was like quite an interesting as like a shortcut to maybe think about that identity.
Yeah.
And then on the landmine point, again from Stripe, actually no, not from Stripe, sorry. This was from Netflix. In that culture book that they wrote, which is Powerful by Patty McCord, I think. It's a really good book on culture. I highly recommend that you check it out. And they have a lot of really great anecdotes around like, a good culture is about a high-performing sports team. It's not necessarily about family, because family implies unconditional love. We're here to win. We have objectives. It's a business at the end of the day. We need to make sure that we, can be sustainable. But the other interesting anecdote that they talk about is, I think it was at the .com crash or the 2008 crash, like one of the big kind of like turning points, they laid off like 40% of their staff. And I think that was at the point when they were still doing DVD deliveries. And what ended up happening is that actually the performance of the company increased, because all of a sudden a lot of the B and C players got removed out of the organization, and actually everyone then felt much more empowered and much more excited, because the one thing that I've always seen is like A players want to work with other A players, and
100%.
The team often, like, just at some point, I think it's like a moral compass that I think teams just gravitate towards the lowest common denominator. So, and I think it's also maybe connected to a little bit to give and take, Adam Grant, like, one good apple won't fix the tree, but one bad apple will like rot the whole tree.
Yeah.
So the impact that one individual can have on the whole team, because they can bring down the whole energy and enthusiasm, I think is like so important. And it's interesting to see it across so many different examples. And it makes me think whether this upcoming recession and all the layoffs are actually going to potentially have a really positive impact for some companies. I guess big question around whether they're well managed and have the right culture and can then identify and remove the right underperforming talent in the first place. But yeah, it'll be really interesting to see what happens in the next kind of 12 to 18 months.
I agree. It's going to be very interesting to observe that. I agree. It's also one of those things that I think often it's so hard to measure and so hard to pinpoint, right? Because changes, and this thing changes and that thing changes, and it's going to be hard to say. But yeah, I do agree with you. So we'll see.
Yeah, and I think that maybe the last point on culture that I find really interesting is like, I find there's no such thing as good or bad culture. There's only like strong or weak culture, which is like, strong culture means like, is it easily identifiable? Can everyone like clearly articulate it? And then I think there's probably also culture, product, market, industry fit as well, where I think, some companies with some cultures tend to do really good within certain domains and certain kind of like industries. Like I think GitLab and Zapier as like remote companies, given that maybe it's the nature of their product and their industries that really made a difference, them being kind of like remote teams. I'm wondering if there's a fit there that's also worth thinking about.
Probably. It's almost never one size fits all, right?
Yeah.
And it's often hard to talk about the culture. And I feel like, man, I've got obviously so much to learn about it, how to really build a strong culture. Would be an interesting question, I suppose, to just ask all team members, what do you think our culture is? And see how much those answers are aligned, right? Because I guess if they're fairly aligned, then by the definition that you mentioned before, that would be a relatively strong culture, because at least the internal team members are sort of aligned on how they define it. But yeah, it's tricky, and I think whenever I have a conversation about the culture, it often gets like very fluffy, right? There's no right answer. I've never seen a blueprint like, okay, here's a 5-step, five steps how to build good company culture. It's really not like that. But again,
yeah. And I find it's also, especially with big companies that I've interacted with, culture also sometimes can get really muddied because it can be very disingenuous. And I think sometimes that leaves a really bad taste in people's mouth as well, when it's like, hey, we're really like transparent, entrepreneurial kind of like company, and it's like, oh, but like Bob got fired because he tried that thing, and it, a quarter in it wasn't really showing signs of success, so and no one talks about Bob or that project anymore, so it's neither transparent or like entrepreneurial.
Yeah, that's also true. Exactly, especially because it's so cool to say, yeah, we're like super entrepreneurial and we're super innovative. I guess that sounds attractive, but it doesn't. I guess depends what's your definition of innovation and entrepreneurship, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Good.
But I'm also conscious of time. We've run over quite a bit.
We've pushed this to nearly 2 hours. Wow, incredible, amazing. So I'm glad we did it, and I hope it's going to be interesting for everyone else as well. Thank you so much again. We'll stay in touch, and good luck with everything that you're doing.
Thanks, Matisse. Thanks for having me. This has been a lot of fun.
Nice. All right, take care. Thanks for listening until the end. I hope you enjoyed it. If you like the content, please do me a favor and click the like button on YouTube, or give us 5 stars on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever it is that you listen to your podcasts. Leave a comment. Subscribe if you want to hear more from us. That really helps also to get the podcast out there, and that helps me get more interesting guests and create even more interesting content. So I really appreciate if you do that. If you have any other comments, questions, feel free to message me. You can find me on Twitter. That's usually the best channel. The link should be somewhere in the description. And check out my Twitter. I try to tweet interesting stuff about similar content that we talk about on the podcast. Key insights from the podcast as well, and just generally stuff that I learn and stuff that I do. So see you. Thanks.